You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 25th of July, 2024, on Monocle Radio.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu travels a long way in search of a receptive audience. China's government tries to find ways to tell China's people that they'll have to work longer, and Henley and Partners' annual survey of the world's most welcomed passports put the champagne on ice, Turkmenistan. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Julie Norman and Kerry Brown will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is sent from Sorrento. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Julie Norman, lecturer in politics and international relations at UCL and co-director of the UCL Centre on US Politics, and by Kerry Brown, director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London and author, most recently, of The Great Reversal. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hi. Kerry, regular listeners to the Daily may already have heard you talking about The Great Reversal, which doesn't mean we're going to stop you from caning it again tonight. We were trying to decide earlier whether or not this was your first appearance on the Daily. We think you might have been on before, but not for ages. So we'll kind of treat you like a first-timer, but perhaps with a bit less overt hazing. If you could explain to our listeners who you are and how you got here.
Yeah, with pleasure. It's good to be back, I think. I'm a professor of Chinese Studies and director of the Institute of Chinese Studies at King's College. I was a diplomat before in the early 2000s for the Foreign Commonwealth Office. I worked for Chatham House. I was a professor at Sydney University. I've written several books on China, on Xi Jinping, the great leader of China, on Britain's history of China, which is the most recent one, The Great Reversal, which is a story of Britain's history since the 1600s, when Elizabeth I wrote, I think, 4 letters to the Wanli Emperor saying that we have need of trade with your great country. So nothing much has changed in 4.5 centuries, and mostly deal with Chinese elite politics and the Chinese economy. So that's where I'm coming from.
That title again, The Great Reversal, is it in all good stores now?
It is, yes. I looked in foils today and it was there right at the front. This is a proud moment. My life has been nothing before being right at the front of foils. I've lived for this moment for a long time.
I would never in my entire life believe an author who claims that they don't go into bookshops looking for their own works. I've done it myself, and by golly, I will again. Julie, you haven't been with us for a while because you have, it turns out, been in Jerusalem.
That's right. I've been based in Jerusalem for the last month or so. I'm currently writing a book on Gaza. So I was spending the month speaking with Palestinians and Israelis from all walks of life about what's been going on since October 7th and over the course of the war, and just learned so much, heard so many things from so many different people during what's a very difficult time in the region.
I mean, we will be touching on that very shortly, but one thing I was curious about, when you're in Jerusalem, where obviously there is quite a lot of commingling of Israeli and Palestinian people, do you get a sense that they are still living in, I guess, parallel worlds after October 7th? Or is there, in fact, some amount of commingling of views of what actually happened and what has happened since?
I would say the two communities overall are extremely different from each other right now and very isolated from each other with very hardened views. I will say in Jerusalem is the one place you do see some of that commingling, say on the light rail or just, in shops and that kind of thing. But in terms of just where the narratives are, where most people are feeling and holding things, extreme divisions right now, and I don't think that will change until the war ends, until hostages are released.
Well, we will start in the United States, where Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been winning friends in his usual ebullient fashion. Addressing a joint session of the US Congress for a record 4th time for a foreign leader, overhauling Winston Churchill, Netanyahu dismissed American opponents of Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza as Iran's useful idiots. In recognition of how many of of same are among disaffected Democratic voters, presumptive nominee Vice President Kamala Harris found somewhere else to be, as did former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, though Pelosi clearly caught the speech, which she described as, quote, by far the worst presentation of any foreign dignitary invited and honoured with the privilege of addressing Congress, a field which includes Silvio Berlusconi. Kerry, is it clear to you why Netanyahu was invited back? I mean, this did seem like an address to the joint session, which could have been an email.
Yeah, I'm a complete novice on this. I've only been to Israel twice, and most recently was in 2019, actually, before these problems started. And I find Israeli politics extremely bewildering.
So, in my experience, to most Israelis, if that's any consolation.
But I am kind of amazed by how Netanyahu is this sort of survivor, right? I mean, he's just never goes away. I mean, wasn't he voted out a while ago and now he's back?
Repeatedly.
Yeah, so it's kind of a masterclass in survival. And why, kind of he survives. Well, that's, there's experts on that. But I find it's a treacherous sort of issue to talk about. I'm a bit like the Chinese government. I pretend I'm friends with everyone and then try and keep far away from it. Win-win and then get away. Yeah.
Julie, Netanyahu is obviously struggling for a sympathetic audience at home, as you've doubtless seen up close. So who was he trying to reach with this speech, if we proceed on the assumption it wasn't going to impress many people in Israel?
Yeah, I mean, I do think this was certainly multi-track. One was to, I think, shore up some support back home, especially with more of the right wing, to show that he is still the statesman that gets multiple invitations to the United States and speaks before joint sessions and whatnot. But there was a practical level to it, too, with really trying to ensure that U.S. funding, U.S. arms, U.S. intelligence, and U.S. diplomatic support continues, and trying to make a bipartisan support. And I think he was trying to do that through both kind of moral claims, framing what's happening in Gaza as not just a clash of civilizations, but civilizations against barbarism, this kind of thing, but also interests, and saying to the U.S., look, we're fighting this war on your behalf. We're protecting the world from Iran, and trying to frame it in those terms also. And I'll just say, there's been comparisons to him having this Churchillian kind of impulse. But I think what we almost saw him doing was kind of taking a page from Zelensky's playbook and trying to say, frame this as this fight for democracy, say we need your arms, we need more of them faster, and almost copying exactly kind of the Zelensky appeal that we've seen, for very different reasons resonate.
I did want to broaden this out to talk a bit about US politics more generally, and obviously that overlap is where you live a lot of the time, Julie. So there is clearly an issue the Democrats are worried about, that they are losing a portion of their support, which is annoyed with Joe Biden in particular. They clearly, I think, hope to get some of that back because they hope those voters won't associate Kamala Harris with that. However, Harris today, interestingly, has gone in really hard on the protests against Netanyahu, condemning the pro-Hamas graffiti that was sprayed on certain monuments, and going in extra hard on the person who burned the US flag. So where is Harris going with that? Does that suggest that the Democrats are still a bit spooked?
Yeah, I think it's a little too early to say what Harris's position is going to be on the Middle East. She's been playing it very carefully so far, essentially towing the administration's line, but I think trying to come out a little bit more vocally for humanitarian aid, for civilian protections from the beginning. And then now I think trying to draw a line between, protests on behalf of civilians, but also differentiating that from, say, support for Hamas or what are seen as an American kind of protest. So I think she's straddling this line that's just very difficult right now for the Democratic Party. And to your first question, this speech wasn't something that Netanyahu just invited himself over for. The Republican Speaker of the House intentionally invited him because they knew this was a very divisive issue for Democrats, and it puts Democrats on the back foot.
Kerry, we did also hear last night, or at least early this morning, our time, now officially outgoing President Joe Biden. What did you... Well, it's not quite his farewell address, but this was a sort of preliminary leave-taking. What did you make of it? Do you think he's entirely adjusted to the reality? There was that defiant note about, I think I deserved a second term, but...
Well, yeah, he saved his best till last, right? I mean, that was the best speech he's made for quite some time. It's very poignant, actually. It's a bit like King Lear, kind of. I've sort of found it almost Shakespearean, though hopefully without the completely tragic outcome. I mean, these people, politicians, I remember years ago talking to some people about politics. Actually, this was American politicians in 2008. And I think it was why Hillary Clinton wouldn't get out of the race with Obama. I don't know if you remember in 2008. And someone was explaining, well, politicians are not like that, right? They just don't give up. That's why they get where they are. They're made of different things. And he just shook his head and said, and that's the problem. I mean, it's their strength and it's also their kind of, why they're quite hard to deal with. I mean, this man has been at the top of American politics for 50 years, right? I mean,
elected to the Senate 72, if I recall rightly.
Didn't Nixon sort of phone him when he was president to get, kind of offer his condolences on the death of his first wife? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is American politics for 52 years, good or bad. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to give that up. I'm surprised, I suppose. I am quite surprised he did. But, well, it's been a game changer. This has been really entertaining. I'm not sure. It's quite sort of dangerous entertainment, but it's been quite entertaining watching this whole thing.
Well, just finally on that, Julie, do you get the sense from, well, understanding America better than anybody else at the table, that there is a perceptible Harris bounce, if you were, because there was this sense that the Democratic Party was trudging wearily to the gallows. And do you think that has changed?
I do think it has. I think it will be interesting to see how long that lasts. I mean, we're less than a week after this announcement, and there is just an energy that we didn't have. I do feel there was this sense before of just slouching towards this election that nobody wanted, and now there's at least a fresh face. People are mobilized in a different way, et cetera. But, Harris is still unproven, and the way that the Democrats have coalesced around her extremely quickly, I think, is something that many will question. And, she'll be in the spotlight and people will see her strengths, but also her weaknesses.
Well, to Laos now, where foreign ministers and assorted grandees from ASEAN are meeting, along with such keenly interested observers as US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. While it is rarely difficult to fill the agenda at such conclaves, it being an eventful part of the world, this one seems likely to be dominated by the war in Myanmar, which is spiralling into one of its periods of getting worse, not better, and which history shows, including extremely recent history, has a habit of bursting beyond Myanmar's borders. Kerry, first of all, I mean, it's hard to think of, well, what is a normality you could measure Myanmar against, but how bad are things right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think since the military coup, if you can call it that, 2 or 3 years ago, I mean, it's been extremely unstable. And I kind of, it's a difficult one because obviously America is deeply involved, but China, it's one of these issues where, these two superpowers sort of sniff around it and they feel like it's theirs. So it'll be interesting at ASEAN to see Blinken and Wang Yi's dynamics, because they've got enough on their plate anyway. And what kind of political capital and diplomatic capital they'll give to this issue. Because, I mean, it's just sort of been a perpetual problem for quite some time. There's not really a sort of functioning government in waiting, though, because the military have basically decimated that. I mean, they put them all in jail or they've kicked them abroad. Aung San Suu Kyi has, her copybook is blotted from last time, and I mean, she's in detention again. So there's no sort of last time, when the military kind of basically, kind of acquiesced to elections, at least she was there with her party. And now what is there? It's very, very difficult to work out what the game plan would be for a sort of new government if they did decide to have elections.
I mean, when you look at the spectacle, or at least imagine the spectacle, Julie, of Blinken and Wang at the ASEAN gathering, are we seeing there a bit of old-school sphere of influence jostling? Do both China and the United States kind of see this as their backyard, even if they won't say it out loud?
I mean, I think there's going to be that great power jostling regardless, but I will say it's actually interesting to me how much of a foreground Myanmar has in this ASEAN convention. And I worked on a project in Myanmar a few years ago, and it was bad then. And now just seeing 3 million people displaced, I think almost 30,000 people in prison, and just these very, young people trying to keep this movement going forward is striking. So if anything, I'm encouraged that there is some some international attention to it for once. I think usually the superpowers get a little over-involved in things they shouldn't, whereas this is like, we actually need some attention here. And I think ASEAN has tried to float this approach that they could, have some kind of ceasefire, have a mediation, have an envoy. They're not an organization that's really positioned to do that well, and they're going to need some backing from states that can actually help with that if there's going to be any kind of difference made in Myanmar.
I mean, Kerry, readily imaginable that there could be some sort of solemn communique issued about Myanmar off the back of this. Indeed, it would be surprising if there wasn't. But is there actually anything that ASEAN could do about the war in Myanmar, even if ASEAN collectively decided on something?
Yeah, ASEAN is famously toothless. In the past, Singapore has sort of put out stronger statements, usually taking the lead. In fact, I think once they did on Myanmar, but in a couple of times in the past, they've been more critical. But the parties that will have a difference are not members of ASEAN; they're the observers, right? I mean, that's why this meeting matters.
Well, follow up then. If China decided it wanted to do something about the war in Myanmar, could it?
Well, it could, but it won't. I mean, there's a very simple reason for that. It just doesn't want to be sucked into these unless it absolutely has to, which would have to be pretty bad. It just won't be sucked into it. It's not. ASEAN is all about obsessive sovereignty. All the members, their sovereignty was hard won. From colonization, and for China to sort of get into that game would sort of buck the narrative too, because it is also obsessed by sovereignty, right? It's the greatest export the West has ever made to Asia. Sovereignty heavy. And I think for China to get involved in a meaningful way would be, it will do things diplomatically, but it will not, want to kind of dispense diplomatic capital here when it's got so many other things like the South and East China Sea and elsewhere where it's having fights. So I don't think it will want to do it on Myanmar unless it gets really, tumultuous.
Julie, is this one of those things? And ASEAN is not the only organisation or state that would have been guilty of this kind of thinking, of regarding something terrible and thinking, yeah, this is terrible. However, trying to fix it would be worse.
Yeah, well, like I said, I think the fact that they've kind of put forward this like 5-step plan is very interesting for them, like as an organization, to even try that. And they are toothless, they won't be able to do it, but it's more like that sense of even thinking in that more like peacemaking space is really interesting. And of course, we've seen, China starting to position itself in that way too with different conflicts. And so I think just that shift is an interesting one that we're seeing in the world today when there is so much conflict that organizations and states that we don't really think about as peacemakers are trying to put themselves in that space. And is there more that could be done there in the future?
Just before we move off this, Kerry, while we have you here as veteran China watcher, as we discussed on an earlier show this week, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has been visiting Wang Yi in Beijing. Interestingly, and I think possibly significantly, at Wang Yi's invitation. What do you think is going on there?
Oh, I'm probably cynical, but I think China's positioning itself for the rebuild. I think they did have big kind of investments and energy interests in Ukraine. And this is why this Russia-China thing is kind of weird, because I don't think it's entirely in China's interest what Russia did in Ukraine. I think that they've got to keep good relations with this neighbour that they have a 5,000-kilometre border with. And so, they kind of will stick by Russia. But at the end of the day, they'll see it as an opportunity too. The peace proposals, you just referred to peace proposals. China produced these template peace proposals, which is usually 2 words: don't fight. That's it. And then, everything is solved. So for the Middle East, it produced this peace proposal. And that's the same for Ukraine. But it'd be interesting in October if anything comes of this visit. It's quite an interesting, important visit. Xi Jinping has met Putin, I think, 3 times this year, 4 times. And so actually it's quite meaningful. They might do something in August. They might see an opportunity. And that will, kind of to be a sort of soft mediator in this. Yeah, it would be good for China's soft power. It's not likely, but it might happen. It's not impossible.
Well, we'll stay in China, which has become the latest country to try explaining to its citizens that an old age pension was only ever supposed to tide people over for a few years before they dropped obligingly dead in late middle age, not underwrite a holiday lasting decades. A Chinese person born now can reasonably look forward to 78 years of corporeal existence, but retirement ages in the People's Republic are low. 60 for men, 55 for women in office work, 50 for women doing manual labour. While Chinese politicians do not, of course, have to concern themselves overmuch with what voters might think, this will nevertheless not be popular. We'll talk about China specifically shortly, Julie, but first of all, this is not a problem unique to them. Every country on earth which has a pension system is having to grapple with this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we talked about France doing this at some point on the show, which always seems to be happening.
Predictably filled the streets with people throwing cafe tables at the gendarmes.
Exactly. But no, I feel like all states are having to deal with this. One, just as populations, live longer, but also as, states just face these perennial budget crunches and deficits that they feel they need to do something. And so, obviously there's tensions with it. Older people don't like having to work longer, but even younger people, I think, look at this and say, okay, it's already hard enough to get a job. Now you're having older people stay in these jobs even longer. So it's politically extremely difficult, even though economically there's an argument for it.
I mean, there is an extraordinary statistic, Kerry, which does illustrate something of what the People's Republic, for all its flaws, has accomplished. Life expectancy in 1949 was 36. It is now, as we were saying, 78. I mean, it does seem self-evident that some sort of adjustment to reality is overdue.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it was low in the 1950s because there were so many people who died in childbirth. So if you were born and lived a few months, then you would live into your 50s and 60s. Infectious diseases has become less important. It's mostly chronic illnesses now, like in Western countries. And so the pension system has always been a massive problem because there's a state pension system and then there's provincial pension systems. And then in the past they've been, kind of associated with huge amounts of corruption. So there's sort of that dynamic. There's also demographics. I mean, the fact that the country's aging. And you've got people who only have one child. There's not a family support system, which was basically their form of social welfare until quite recently. And so, I mean, this is not quite the same political issue, I guess, in Europe of pensions, making people work longer. I mean, that kind of dynamic, the impact it has on, as you said earlier, electoral politics. It's more about a kind of massive social change where you've got fundamental things like old people, kind of not being looked after. In China, this is the family structure usually was there to do that. And so now you can't have it. Young people are working and having families and, they don't have the ability to look after the elderly. And the elderly are often not in the same place as their children because the children have moved to the cities. So it's about this massive social change. And I mean, the fact that for officials, I think the retirement age, as you said, was 55 or 60. I mean, that's bizarre. I mean, that would have to change. For most people, though, the pension, when you do get it, is minuscule. I mean, it's a very, very small amount. I mean, it was raised by 20 kwai, which is about £2, in the last sort of budget, the National People's Congress earlier this year. But it's really not so much about the pensions, it's about this enormous demographic time bomb that China is sitting on, and other places, but China, because of the scale, which is really starting to hit now. It's really starting to hit. I mean, by 2100, China's population would probably have fallen to 700 million from the figure now, 1.4 billion. And so no one has a sort of plan for this. You talk to officials in China and, I mean, they think robots are going to look after people, right? I mean, so it's extremely weird. They don't have any notion of a liberal immigration policy. That's absolutely unthinkable. So it's really interesting to see how they're going to deal with this very inevitable and pretty rapid issue that's kind of hitting them already.
Julie, just finally on this, and I have no idea how you would begin to sell this to voters in a democracy, but is there nevertheless a positive case for this? Because as Kerry was just alluding to here, it does seem vaguely absurd that in places all around the world, people are elbowed out of public sector jobs, especially when they have decades of institutional knowledge behind them, and now, because it is no longer the 1930s, potentially entirely useful and productive and healthy decades in front of them.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's always been some of the defense to not have people feel like, okay, you hit a certain age, you're not useful to us anymore. You have to go retire. And, I think obviously we see a bit of a fracture between more, labor-based jobs that are, traditionally called more blue-collar, and then more, white-collar jobs where people often can and do want to keep working well past a given age. And so I think all this is part of the mix. But I do think when you need to sell it politically, that's usually the way, a sense of like, we value people and we want them to keep doing what they love to do a little bit longer.
Well, to the latest Henley Passport Index, an annual ranking of which passports will get their holders across the most borders with the least hassle, Singapore has reclaimed top spot. Its citizens may now swan into fully 195 other countries without a visa, knocking into joint second place France, Germany, Italy, Japan and Spain, who must content themselves with 192. The world's weakest passport, meanwhile, posting an all-time record low of visa-free access to just 26 countries, 26 remarkably trusting countries in this instance, is that of Afghanistan. Kerry, what is Singapore's secret? Is it just that thing of like they're incredibly rich and they don't really upset anybody?
Yeah, per capita GDP of what, $80,000 US dollars. I mean, I'm wistful when I hear this, as a British passport holder. When I go to Europe now, I don't know what passports you hold, but it's a big hit, You queue in the sort of non-EU thing. You can't go through the gates. It's made me realise, it's a precious thing. I mean, that's not a visa issue, but it's just the fact that you're not, just allowed to kind of go through in a way.
On which note, I am holding Julie personally responsible for the 2 hours I had to queue at Dulles DC Airport.
God, Dulles is the worst.
The other week.
Yeah. So one of my jobs when I was in the Foreign Office in 2005, for 6 months, the thing that finished me off and made me go into the think tank world was I was head of visa policy at the UK Foreign Office Home Office thing. And the first day I arrived there, I remember asking someone, what's the policy? And they said, get the Daily Mail and look at the front page. That's the sort of thing.
Well, that's heartwarming.
Yeah, because at that time Britain had a really, really liberal regime because the economy was great and we just basically wanted kind of skilled migrants to come here. The City of London had 5,000 South Africans. Kind of basically fruit picking was done by mostly people from Central, Eastern Europe or Central Asia. We would literally give visas. You would tell visa officers, look, there are certain demographic you shouldn't ever give visas to. And then we would tell them, no, because we need people to come and do these jobs, then you would have to do that. So visa policy is really led by public feeling. It's not led by, kind of anything rational. Working visas, the point system that we were trying to copy from Australia, never really, it was very rational, but we couldn't really use it. It's always led by, kind of what the public feels. And at the moment, the public in Britain feel strongly about immigration. And therefore, visa policy is not easy. Getting visas if you're, from a lot of countries now for Britain is quite onerous.
Big climbers in the list over the years they've been doing this, Julie, include China and the United Arab Emirates. Mm-hmm. What does that tell us?
Well, it's places that people, like those countries, want people to do business with them and vice versa. So I think, in addition to the domestic politics, I think a lot of the visa, stuff is reciprocal. So it's like if you're letting us in, we'll let you in. And countries that are very active on international trade, international business want to make that easy and attractive. And so they usually try and use that up a little bit.
I did want to close by asking you each in turn about not so much the Henley Passport Index, but what we might think of as the soft power applications of whatever passport you carry. You've sort of alluded there to it, Kerry. words in the right order in that sentence. Because I have often found, travelling on an Australian passport, that it does have a tendency to lower the temperature in potentially rickety situations because, no offence, it's often assumed that I am American or British, and that can bring certain assumptions to an encounter, especially with angry armed people at checkpoints. But if you show them this thing that has a kangaroo and an emu on the front, and are then able to point out your place of birth as Wagga Wagga, New South Wales, it all sort of becomes kind of comic light opera reasonably quickly. Julie, you don't get that with an American passport, I'm guessing.
No, it's all about the animals. I mean, the eagle just does not compare to kangaroo. What can I say? But I will say I'm covering my bases. I have US, I have UK, and I'm on track to get my Italian. So I think I'll be all set. No, I'm serious. But I will say, the two biggest trips I've had this last summer have been going into Israel, where I used my US passport, which goes over better than UK. And then I was in China, where I used my UK passport, which goes over a lot better than US at the moment. So
they're not huge fans of the UK, though, China.
No, but I was actually told at a checkpoint by a Chinese colleague who didn't know I was also American, oh, it's a good thing we don't have any Americans here because they would have given you a hard time. And I was just like, hee hee.
Kerry, what has your experience been, apart from having to stand in longer queues in Europe than you used to?
Having a British passport? Yeah, I mean, it's very convenient. I mean, the funny thing about the visa thing, right, and, kind of almost all studies show that the more liberal and open your visa policy is, the better your economy will be. They're kind of overwhelming. And yet, still, it's very, very hard to get people to change their visa policy. It's a sort of weird thing. I mean, It's
notable from the index, India ranks still incredibly low, but I suspect that may be due to bureaucratic ineptitude than actual active xenophobia.
But I mean, only recently I went to one country which will remain nameless, and for the first time in my life, I had one of these paper visas, and I kind of, presented it, and then the guy just said he's going to give me sort of special service, and he sort of sorted everything out, and then basically said, what's the fee? He wanted money at the checkpoint. And I've never actually, in 50 countries, I've never had that happen before. And I don't know if that's because now you're given these you're emailed these visas, right? I mean, they're e-visas, and that's opened up spaces for people to exploit it. I don't know. In many ways, it's become really, really easy to get a lot of these visas. It's become very streamlined. And not as exciting as it used to be when you used to queue up and fight like hell in Melbourne. I remember my first Chinese visa was in Melbourne at the Consul General in Melbourne, and the woman literally chucked me. The visa officer took this British passport, soft power, you can forget that. She just chucked it at me with the visa, and that was my first visit. So I have happy memories of that consulate.
Kerry Brown and Julie Norman, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it is the next chapter in our Letter From series. This week we head to Sorrento, where if one thing can be said for certain, it is that no amount of pleas from exhausted locals can stop the torrential flow of tourists. I guess it's just that good. Here to tell us more is Monocle's Emma Nelson.
It's 1:30 in the afternoon, and Antonio is in full service at Lionelli's beach. It's so hot. Mere mortal sunseekers dance in agony when naked feet meet Sorrento's volcanic sand. But not Antonio's. His red tray groans with gin tonic, thick glass litres of Peroni, and bowls of pasta, pizza, and chips, chips, chips. His squat frame and backwards-facing baseball cap can handle it all, because this is a man who knows his métier and whose body has been rebuilt to book sunbeds, master the walkie-talkie orders from the waterside cafe, and then haul food and drink under Sorrento's blazing sun, terrifyingly barefoot, across baking hot sand. An Italian said to me recently, "Don't expect perfection from us. You'll never get it." But Italians are beautiful, and no more so than in the Bay of Naples. There are still moments when you know you're never going to get all your change back, or that we may be renegotiating the price up when the taxi journey ends. But Italy and its people can make stuff happen. If your driver, Vito, is not free to pick you up from the airport, no problem. Try Lorenzo. He's on WhatsApp. Lorenzo, not close enough. Maurizio is 10 minutes away. Oh, and he has an Airbnb in Naples, just in case you want to go there instead of your pre-booked hotel. Because this is how holidays work here. A stream of Italian strangers who'll do you a turn in 10 minutes. Old school Neapolitan know-how matched with 2024 tech. This is not the only thing that's changed around here. As well as the locals hitting the beach on a Sunday, all slender-shouldered ragazzi and chit-chat on those floating flamingos, the main voices heard here today hail from the States. Well-heeled New Yorkers here to visit the birthplace of their grandmother. Older, child-free couples chugging down beers in the pool. Big hats, big voices, bulging big swimming costumes. It's all gone White Lotus Season 2. And it feels like Sorrento lost its battle against over-tourism long ago. No number of attempts by the local authorities to curb the number of cars, or even tourists themselves screaming, "Don't come here," online, are going to stop the flow. Because the bay has become a massive children's bathtub, rammed with vessels. As Antonio carts out a fourth round of Rossini's, a drink the colour of sweet violence, over his shoulder lurks the mega cruise liner, its flotilla of little orange tenders ferrying more and more to the shore. They're picking their way through to the 5th hydrofoil to splurt its filthy way off to Ischia, Positano or Capri. There must be 200 holidaymakers on each one, and everyone here gets a slice of the pie. Even the fishermen who take you out to catch your dinner, for a price. And the super yachts discreetly appearing to set up for the weekend. In the distance, ever present, is Vesuvius, presiding menacingly over it all. Giant, active and threatening to blast away everyone's fun in a second. But no one's going to tell me that this year we should sacrifice this hot slice of heaven for somewhere less crowded, or better value, or even less vulnerable to volcanic eruptions. Because, just like Antonio's hot drinks tray, there's always space to cram in just a little bit more.
That was Emma Nelson in Sorrento, and that is it for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Julie Norman and Kerry Brown. The show was produced by Henry Rees Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.